Hello everybody, welcome to UK Gaming Network. I'm Brian, also known as UK Jan Zoidberg, and this is Retrogaming Superleagues, where I rank all of the games that I've played in a selected category. If you're watching this video, then this is actually part 2 of my countdown of all side-scrolling shooters on the Amiga. If you've not watched part 1 yet, I'll hang around for a second while you just go and do that. All done? Good. Right. In the last video, I covered all the games from A to N in the alphabet, and this is going to cover O to Z. So, without any further ado, let's crack on with it. So, here we are again with another selection of games to go through. I've got 44 of them for this video, including some that I did leave out last time round. But they are going to be ranked in one of these 5 categories: essential, recommended, good, poor, or rubbish. So let's get to the first game. So first up we have The Oath, which was released in 1991 from Attic Entertainment, and this is a pretty solid looking game until you realise that a lot of the scenery and backgrounds are all pretty much identical and you can't really determine which is which. And not knowing what's going to kill you essentially extends to the enemies as well, as I constantly found myself blowing up with no idea as to why. And that unfortunately ends up making it a game that's more frustrating than it is fun, and I didn't really want to continue playing it. So unfortunately we are going to start off this list with a game in the poor category. Next up we have Outzone, which also came out in 1991. This is from French developer Lancor, and this is quite possibly the most bizarre game on this list, as it is a combination between a block puzzle game and a side-scrolling shooter, although it's probably more shooter than anything else. Strangely though, that actually works quite well. Trying to match the correct blocks before your transport ship crashes can actually be pretty tense and addictive. And it also looks quite nice too. It's probably not a game that you'll keep coming back to time and again, but there's enough here to make it worth playing at least once. And so for that reason I'm going to stick it in the good category. Next game we have Overkill, which came out in 1993 from Vision Software, published by Mindscape. And this is, as far as I'm concerned, the best version of Defender that you can play on the Amiga. It looks fantastic, it's got great parallax scrolling, it's really playable, the controls are tight, and it enhances what's already a particularly great formula without going too far with the power-ups and the structure of the game. It's got plenty of levels to battle your way through in single player mode, but it also features some really good 2-player modes as well. So for me, this one is definitely going to go in the essential category, so that's where I'm putting it. Now we come to P-47 the Freedom Fighter, released in 1990, published by Firebird and developed by Source. This is a fairly average arcade conversion, but it does at least have the 2-player mode that the 8-bit versions didn't have. The graphics are a pretty good approximation of the arcade original without being spectacular, and at least it does move smoothly, I suppose. Unfortunately though, the gameplay isn't all that great, as you don't seem to be able to fire fast enough to destroy some of the waves, even if you have an auto-fire joystick, and that kind of kills it for me. So I don't think it's quite bad enough for the poor category, so I'm going to stick this at the bottom of the good. Next up we have Pegasus, which came out in 1991, published by Gremlin and developed by Optimus, more well known for all the Dizzy games that they made for Codemasters. This is a pretty good looking and original shooter that sees you riding the mythical flying horse, which makes a great alternative to what you would normally be controlling. Unfortunately, the on-foot sections between each of the flying levels are a definite step down in quality for me, and the game would have been far better off without them. I suppose the novelty value of the game overall does begin to wear off after a little while because of the high number of levels, but the graphics do get better the further that you get into the game, and that more than makes up for it. So I think this is going to go in the good category. I don't think it's quite good enough for recommended, but it's definitely better than the 2 games in good so far, so I'm going to put it above those 2. Next up, we have Phalanx II, The Return, released in 1987 from a developer called Digital Dreams, published by Kingsoft. And this is pretty awful, to be honest. Spectrum and Commodore 64 owners got Uridium. The Amiga got this hopeless rip-off. The scrolling is smooth, which is probably about the only good thing that you can say about it. But that doesn't make anything on the screen any clearer, as you still can't see anything, especially once you get past the first level. Everything is just so stiff to control. Changing from one direction to another takes an absolute age, which essentially kills the gameplay. So this one is going to go in the rubbish category. Next up, we have Phobia, released in 1989, published by Imageworks and developed by Tony Crowther. And this is, for me, an overly difficult and messy game, which does have some nice graphical effects, but the gameplay is really annoying. Being able to split your craft into two for extra firepower is a really good idea, but it ultimately doesn't really serve any purpose. Safe to say that Tony Crowther has made many better games than this one. So this one's going to go in the poor category, and I'm going to put it below The Oath. Next up, we have Powder, which actually came out in 1998 from a developer called 5 Stars VG Studio. And even though this did come out quite late on for the Amiga, there's nothing about it to suggest that it came out in that year, as it looks and plays incredibly basic. Especially compared to some of the other games on this list that are nowhere near as new. It simply has too much going on screen, and you end up having no idea what's going to hurt you and what isn't. And for a game like this, that it kills it completely. So this is also going to go in the poor category, and I think I'm going to put this one below Phobia. Now we come to Project X from Team 17. First released in 1992 and then again in 1993. So let's first of all talk about the original release, and you'll soon see why I've included it twice. When you play it, it's very easy to see why all the reviewers, myself included, were so taken aback by this one on release. It's got excellent graphics, great weapons, and it's all capped off with a superb soundtrack. Some people did accuse this original release of being too difficult, and I kind of disagree on that one, because although it starts off tough, I always really enjoyed the challenge of learning the waves and what power-ups to use and when. I will admit though that some of the later levels probably do get a bit unfair with the number of random attacks that you can't predict, and that is what stops it from being essential for me. So this is the original 1992 release of Project X goes in the recommended category. And then, as I say, it was re-released again in 1993 on budget, but as a special edition. And basically, in an attempt to answer the criticisms of the original game, they made a number of changes, some good, some bad. The good changes that they made were the fact that when you die, you now no longer lose as much power as you did first time around, and that's a definite plus. Unfortunately, everything that they did to shorten the levels ended up making the game feel like a demo version of the main feast, if you know what I mean. Consequently, I've always preferred the real thing to this one, so it's still a recommended game for me, but but the original is what I would play rather than this one, so I'm going to put it below that. Now we come to R-Type, released in 1989, Amiga version developed by Factor 5, the same people behind Turrican, and this is a truly great conversion of arguably the best arcade shooter ever made. No other way I can put it other than that. Any differences between this and the original are so minor that they're barely worth mentioning, so I won't. This is essentially the gold standard by which all other arcade conversions should be measured. So there really is nowhere else I can put it other than at the top of the essential category. Now we come to R-Type 2, which came out in 1991. Change of developer for this one. This was developed by Arc Development, same people who made Dragon Breed. And this is another solid conversion, only this time of a game that's not quite as good as its illustrious predecessor. And I know some people will fight me on that one. My issues with the sequel, though, are purely nitpicks on my part, and I don't mind admitting that. For example, I don't like the double-powered charge shot, for one. I don't think it adds anything to the game. And for the Amiga version at least, I think the graphics are a little bit too cluttered, making some of the enemies blend into the background a little bit too well. Still a great game, but not quite as good as the first, and I am going to put this one below Overkill in the Essential category. Now we come to Reshoot-R, which is actually the sequel to a game called Reshoot that I have not played, and I've not been able to get hold of a copy to play it. This sequel came out in 2019 and is fully playable on Antstream today. And if this sequel is anything to go by, coupled with the excellent third game that I covered in the vertical scrolling shooters, I will definitely be seeking out the original as soon as possible. I really like the gameplay mechanic on this one, where you only have a single life, but every single power-up that you pick up protects you against enemy fire. So every time you get hit, you lose one level of power. And I think that works brilliantly. Occasionally, there are things that you can fly into that blend into the background, but not enough for it to become annoying. To be honest, although you can play it on Antstream, I would recommend that you buy this one for yourself, which you can do from the company's website. So this is also going to go in the Essential category, but I think the three games that are in there already are slightly better than it, so I'm going to put it just at the bottom below those. Now we come to Return to Genesis, which came out in 1988, published by Firebird and developed by Steve Back. And this is another really bad game, attempting to be an Amiga equivalent of Uridium, but missing the mark completely. It's like somebody took Gold Runner and flipped it through 90 degrees, which is not surprising considering it's made by the same person. It's impossible to see where you are flying at any given moment, and I spent the majority of my time playing looking at the scanner at the bottom of the screen rather than the action in the middle of it, and that surely is not how you're meant to play it. So this is going in the poor category, and I think I'm going to put it just below Phobia. Now we come to Revenge of the Mutant Camels, released in 1991 and developed by Llamasoft. This is everything that you would expect from a Jeff Minter game, but for me it lacks the instant appeal of something like Llamatron. The choice of control methods and computer assistance helps to make the game a little bit more accessible, but still not enough to make it essential for me. I find that it is great fun in small bursts, but a little bit too repetitive for my liking, and definitely not one of Jeff Minter's best. So I think I will put this at the bottom of the recommended category, but no higher than that. Now we come to Revenge of the Mutant Camels 2, which is not made by Llamasoft, actually converted by Icon Design, and this came out 3 years before the original game, which is quite somewhat bizarre. But the developer that have made it don't seem to understand what they were doing, or they're definitely not on the same wavelength as the original creator. The graphics, frankly, are a bit of a mess, and the sound has none of the charm of the Commodore 64 original. I would either play and to be honest, I would either play that version on the original 8-bit systems or the previous game, but leave this one alone. And I think this is going to go in the poor category, and I'm going to put it just above Phobia. Now we come to Saint Dragon, which came out in 1990, shortly after the Amiga version of Dragon Breed, and I think that ended up lessening the impact of this one just ever so slightly. And that's a shame, because this is a pretty decent conversion of the Jalico arcade game, although this Amiga version does suffer from slowdown when there's a little bit too much going on screen. Being able to use your tail as a makeshift shield or weapon adds a really nice extra dimension to the gameplay. And although the game starts off really, really good fun, I think the difficulty ramps up quite considerably once you get past the opening level, and that hurts it ever so slightly. I think I put Dragon Breed in the recommended category, didn't I? So I will stick this one in the recommended as well, but I'm going to put it below the 3 games that are in there already. Next up, we have a game called Sarcophaser, which came out in 1988 from the Hack and Slay team, apparently, published by Rainbow Arts. And if ever you want an example of how you shouldn't judge a game by its graphics, look no further than this one. Despite visuals that look like I could have done them in Deluxe Paint, this is a solid Gradius-inspired shooter. It's also not entirely glitch-free, and it definitely has a few translation issues from the German into English. But once you hear the excellent theme music, you'll forget all about that and just get on with playing the game. I think this one is definitely in the good category, and I'm going to put it above Pegasus. Next up, we have Scramble, which came out in 2022, developed by JOTD, who has done quite a few pixel perfect arcade conversions for the Amiga, and this is another one based on the 1981 Konami arcade cabinet. And the arcade original of this one, I will always have a nostalgic feeling about, thanks to it being the only game that was available to me on a family holiday back when I was very small. There are certain elements of the gameplay, admittedly, that haven't aged particularly well, but it's still very well designed and challenging, and I really enjoyed playing this version of it. So I think I'm going to put this one in the good category, and I think I'm going to put it just below Pegasus. Next up, we have Sidearms, which came out in 1989, developed by Probe Software and published by US Gold under their Go label. And I absolutely loved the arcade version of this one, but absolutely hated the Amiga version. It is exactly the type of low effort conversion that gave Probe Software a bad name. It feels almost exactly like it was made by somebody who played the original probably once before they sat down to start programming this one. It's got shockingly poor graphics, terrible controls and awful music. Simply do not play it. This is going to go in the rubbish category, and I think, to tell you just how bad Phalanx is, this is going above it. Next up, we have Silkworm, which came out in 1989, developed by Random Access and published by The Sales Curve and Virgin Interactive. This is a really enjoyable arcade conversion with a decent 2-player mode where one person controls a helicopter and another one controls a jeep. Swiv was inspired by this game, but not actually a direct sequel. Although, admittedly, if you played this in 2-player, you'd probably find that absolutely nobody wanted to be the jeep. What ultimately stopped me from liking the game as much as some other people is the fact that there is no variety whatsoever between the levels. The backgrounds may change, but the enemies and waves repeat over and over and over again. And once you've taken on the same end of level boss for the 3rd or 4th time, it starts to wear out its welcome. So for me, I think Saint Dragon's definitely better. I can't really put this one above the good category, but I am going to put it at the top, just above Sarcophaser. Next up, we have Slayer from Hewson and developer Microwish Software, released in 1989. This is another half-decent Commodore 64 shooter converted to the Amiga, with none of what made the original game so much fun. The gameplay and sound effects are incredibly basic, with the only music playing on the title screen. Most of your time on this one is spent avoiding enemy fire and shooting static objects, as any flying enemies seem to be impervious to your shot. And ultimately, it ended up making a game that was no fun to play whatsoever. I don't really think I can put this one anywhere other than the rubbish category, to be honest, and I am going to put it just above Sidearms. Next up, we have a game called Standard Deviation, which came out in 2017 from a developer called Inertia. Basically, this game suffers from a number of issues that I've already mentioned on this video and the previous episode, namely overpowered enemies, not enough power-ups, and an energy bar rather than lives. The game gives you lots and lots of lives, but I never actually knew when I was losing one until suddenly the game faded to black and I got a game over message. It's a shame, as it does feel well made with some really smooth scrolling and clear presentation all round. It's also one of the few games on this list where being able to shoot the enemy bullets as they're incoming towards you is a really nice touch and does actually add a little extra dimension to the gameplay. I think this is going in the good category, and I think I'm going to put this one just below Scramble. Next up, we have Starbreaker, which came out in 1989, published by Arc Developments and developed by Frames. And there are clearly some talented artists who worked at that developer, as this does have some really nice ship designs and backgrounds. Unfortunately, they've once again been let down by gameplay, which is far too slow and far too jerky for you to actually see what's going on. It also doesn't help that it's got a really tiny play area on screen, with so much of the screen taken up with the HUD, and the collision detection ultimately isn't that great either. So this is definitely going in the poor category, and I think I'm going to put this one just below Phobia. Next up, we have Starbirds, which came out in 1998 and released on public domain, developed by a guy called Sam Jordan. You can tell this one is a public domain title by how basic looking it is, but the game is elevated by having a few really good ideas of its own and lots of different play options being available to the player. It's got a control system that incorporates two different modes of fire, determined by whether you're holding down the fire button or tapping it really rapidly, and that works really nicely. Unfortunately though, it's all accompanied by music that sounds completely out of place. Sounds more like something that you would find in a cute platform game rather than a shooter, and that unfortunately makes it sound not quite right. But I think there's enough about it to put it in the good category, so that's where I'm going to put it, and I think I'm going to put it just above standard deviation. Next up, we have StarRay, released in 1988, developed by Hidden Treasures and published by Logotron. This was actually released in the US as Revenge of Defender as an official sequel, and it's a really fast-moving and playable Defender clone with some really great parallax scrolling. Unfortunately, that also describes quite a few other games on the Amiga. It can occasionally be too difficult to see what's going on, and being able to accidentally shoot the power-ups rather than pick them up is really quite annoying. I spent most of my time playing this one, again, looking at the scanner rather than the screen itself. There are ultimately too many better versions of Defender that you could be playing instead. So it's not a bad game, so it's definitely going in the good category because it's still Defender, but I don't think I can put it any higher than that, and I'm going to put it just above Pegasus. Next up, we have Starush, released in 1991 from Ubisoft, and this is a really good looking and innovative title where each hit that you take changes the type of ship that you're controlling, and sometimes even how you control it. Being able to choose your starting world adds plenty of variety to the gameplay and stops you getting bored. There's a pretty sizable challenge to it as well, that will keep you coming back. But for some people, I think it probably takes a little bit too much effort to learn how to play it properly, and that's ultimately what's going to stop it from being any higher than the good category. And I think I'm going to put this one just below Pegasus. Next up, we have T-Racer, released in 1994 from Virtual Dreams, and this is a pretty blatant rip-off of Project X with some really nice graphics but very little else. The levels drag on for far too long, although the backgrounds look absolutely amazing. They make the enemy fire really hard to see, and having power-ups that are carried by specific enemies would be fine if you could distinguish those enemies from the ones that aren't carrying power-ups, but unfortunately you can't. So once again, can't really go any higher than the good category. I think the bad elements of it just outweigh the good, so it's going to go towards the bottom, and I think I'm going to put it below standard deviation. Next up, we have T-Zero, released in 1999 from developer Clickboom. And this is an extremely polished release that requires some extremely high settings to run. But ultimately, I feel like it's lacking something to make it worth playing. There are a number of different ships that you could pilot with different attributes, but I couldn't really work out how the power-up system in the game works. Also, the attack waves of the enemies themselves are a little bit dull and repetitive, with far too many times where there's nothing of consequence happening on screen. One thing that was also particularly annoying is that having collectibles that reverse your controls is always going to be an instant minus mark from me. So although in terms of presentation this is probably one of the best games that you can see on the Amiga, the gameplay kills it completely, and I'm going to put this one towards the bottom of the good category. I think I'm going to put it below P47. Next up, we have Tinyus, released in 2021, developed by Manfred Linzer, released on public domain. And if that name is familiar, it's because it's the same guy who made Tiny Bobble. Hence the reason why the word tiny appears in the title of this one, but the title doesn't really roll off the tongue in quite the same way. This is a reverse engineered conversion of Gradius, or Nemesis to some UK gamers. If you're a fan of that original arcade game, then everything is here and it's every bit as good as you would want it to be. However, I've always thought that the arcade game was a little bit unforgiving, as if you lose a life you might as well start the entire game from the beginning, and that is all still present and correct here. So I can't put this any higher than the recommended category because it is an absolutely perfect conversion, but I think I'm going to put this one between the two versions of Project X. Next up is a game called Trained Assassin, released in 1989 from Digital Magic Software, and this looks pretty basic, I'm not going to lie, but thanks to a well thought out control method and responsive controls, it is actually quite a bit of fun. It feels more like an 8-bit game, admittedly, especially in its gameplay and execution, plus the game itself is actually a bit too short. There's only a very small number of levels to play through. It tries to combat that fact by the fact that it returns you to the start of a level if you die with none of your power-ups, and that just ultimately ends up making it a bit frustrating. It doesn't end up dropping it into the poor category though, so once again this is going in good, and I think I am going to put this one just below T-Racer. Next we come to Tubular Worlds, released in 1994 from Creative Game Design, and this is a graphically fairly decent game, especially if you play the A1200 version, which has a clear advantage over the A500 one thanks to more colours. It's one of those games where losing all of your power-ups when you die is just plain cruel, as it means that you might as well just restart the entire game, especially as there doesn't seem to be very many checkpoints throughout the levels. I also found that there are too many instances in this one where you die because you flew into the scenery, even though that bit of the scenery looked exactly the same as a bit that you were flying over a second ago. And that is something that shouldn't happen in a game like this. So, unfortunately, not one that I can recommend, but not bad enough for poor. So once again, good category, here we go. And I think I'm going to put this one just above T-Racer. Next up, we have UN Squadron, released in 1990 from US Gold and developed by Tiertex. And just when I thought that I might get through one of these lists without having to mention Tiertex, here they are. If you pause the game on this one or look at some static screenshots, then this looks like a pretty decent conversion of the Capcom arcade game. Once it starts moving though, it's absolutely horrendous. A completely jerky mess where you can't see anything. And it really is a shame, as the presentation of the menu screens and anime story cutscenes have all been recreated brilliantly. But it's absolutely terrible. And so, rubbish section, here we go. And I am going to put this one just above Sidearms. Next up, we have Uridium 2, which came out in 1993 from Graph Gold, published by Renegade. And this is a super slick and extremely long-awaited sequel to the Commodore 64 Classic. It took 8 years after the first, which was eternity back there. It somehow managed to be more than worth that extended wait. When you start playing this one, it can be a little bit overwhelming with the speed, trying to get your eyes to adjust to what's going on. But thankfully, if you're anything like me, you'll soon settle into the groove and start enjoying yourself thoroughly. It's got an absolutely fantastic soundtrack and a challenge that's both tough and fair, and that kept me playing it for months when I first bought it, and I've been coming back to it ever since. So this is definitely going in the essential category, and I think I'm going to put this one above Overkill. Now we come to Videokid, released in 1992, developed by Twilight and published by Gremlin. This is a game that I covered previously on the re-review, and you can kind of think of it as a cartoon variation on D.N.A. Design's Blood Money, and you wouldn't really be far off what this game is. It's got some really nice looking themed worlds based on the different movie genres, but the gameplay unfortunately remains largely the same throughout the entire game. Once again, having an energy bar gets in the way of my fun, and the power-ups themselves aren't really that great, but the game can be fun in small doses. It's not as good as Blood Money, and I put that one in the good category, so that's where this one's going as well. And I think I'm going to put this one just above Tubular Worlds. Next we have Wings of Fury, released in 1990, developed by Unlimited Software and published by Broderbund. And I'd be very surprised if the makers of Jet Strike weren't inspired by this game. Essentially that is a jet-engined version of this. Just like that game, I had a lot of fun learning to fly the planes rather than actually doing the missions. It's one of those games that's absolutely enjoyable for a quick go every now and again, but unfortunately having only one plane means that it lacks the long-term appeal of Jet Strike. But it's definitely a recommended title for me, because it's one of those games that I would always load, and I think I'm going to put it right down at the bottom, just below Saint Dragon. Next up we have Wizball, which came out in 1988. This is a solid conversion of the 8-bit Sensible Software classic that came out on the Commodore 64. It still feels unique all these years later, and although this conversion largely looks and plays the same as the Commodore 64 version, that's not a problem. The early stages of the game can be quite difficult, but the power-up system is really nicely balanced, and the challenge overall quite rewarding. Being able to choose your permanent power-up at the end of each section of the game every time you return to the Wizard's home is a really nice touch, as it means that you don't have to pick those power-ups again the next time that you die. I've always had a little bit of a soft spot for Wizball since I first played it on the Spectrum, and so for me this is going in the recommended category, and I think I am going to put this one above Project X Special Edition. Next up we have a game called Crossout. Yes, Crossout. That's what the game tells you when it's loading in the digitized speech, although looking at the title on the title page, it's clearly X out. The title of the sequel only enforces that. This is one of those games that I remember playing a lot when it came out. The gameplay always felt fair without getting overwhelming. It's really good fun to play around with the different loadouts that you can have, and the different craft that you can choose. It's got some really excellent graphics, full of detail and atmosphere, and a cracking Chris Hulsbeck soundtrack on top of it all. So this is definitely a recommended title for me, and I think I'm going to put this one at the top of that section. I'm going to put it above Project X. And so if you want confirmation that game was called X Out, its sequel was called Z Out. And I always felt that this one was a disappointing step down from the first game, as this feels a lot more generic. It's still got a decent soundtrack, definitely, and the graphics, while clear and smooth, are not quite as good as they were in the first game. Having an auto fire that you can toggle simply by pressing A on the keyboard is a really good inclusion, and the game does have some excellent weapons that you can pick up. Unfortunately, it's one of those games that substitutes throwing more enemies at you for an actual difficulty curve, though. So I'm going to stick this one below Silkworm in the good category. I don't think it's quite good enough for recommended. Next up, we have a game called Ziriax, released in 1990 from a developer called the Wizkids. And this has got some really uninspired gameplay, livened up by some excellent graphics and music. Unfortunately, not enough to keep you playing for long periods. Once again, being able to shoot enemy bullets is a really nice touch, but there are too many enemies in this one that blend into the background, so you don't actually know that they're there until they've killed you. The power-up system also isn't clear enough for my liking, and you don't even get enough pickups to boost the power quickly enough. I think for me, this is not quite enough for the good category, so I'm going to stick this one at the top of the pool. And so for the last game, we have Zynaps, released in 1988, published by Hewson and converted to the Amiga by Microwish Software. This is another woeful conversion of a great Hewson 8-bit title, just like the Amiga got with Exelon and Cybernoid, that were nowhere near as good on the 16-bit systems. I do like the weapon system, which is like a variation on the Gradius system, but doesn't require you to tap the spacebar to select weapons. You simply hold down the fire button instead, and that works really well, but that also worked really well on the original. Ultimately though, it doesn't even look or feel like the same game that was so good on the Spectrum, and you, to be perfectly honest, should just play that one instead. So this is going to go right down at the bottom in the rubbish category, and I think it's probably just better than Slayer, so I'm going to put it above that one. So that's all the games up to the letter Z. There were, however, 3 games I missed in part 1 of this list, which I will thank a lot of the people who commented on that video for pointing out for me. The first of which is Anarchy, which I really don't know how I missed. This was released in 1990, published by Psygnosis under their Cyclops label, and developed by Wayne Smithson under WJS Design. This is a really solid Defender clone with plenty of cool enemies and power-ups. Most of the enemies are presented in a completely different colour to the background, which makes them really stand out, which is completely different to other games from this developer. It's one instance of a game where I don't mind having an energy bar, but it would have been nice if they'd included a more traditional one-hit, one-kill mode for a more hardcore challenge. So it's a good Defender clone, but not quite as good as some of the other ones. Definitely not as good as Overkill. And I am going to stick this one just below X Out in the recommended category. Next we have D.N.A. Warrior, released in 1989 from Artronic, and this is a conversion of an old Commodore 64 game that honestly I'd never heard of. I'd also never played the Amiga version of it before, and frankly I wasn't missing much. The entire game just feels lazy and broken. Power-ups don't appear when they should. Bullets don't hit their intended targets, and worst of all, your ship doesn't turn around automatically like it should, leaving you just sat there on a blank screen doing nothing. Easily the worst game that I've played on this list, and to be perfectly honest, it even competes with Human Killing Machine for the title of worst game on the Amiga. So right down at the bottom of the rubbish category it goes. Don't play it! And then for the final game that I'm going to cover, we have Gainforce, which came out in 1990 from Infernal Byte Systems. And this, just like Lethal Zone from the same developer, was another game that was given away free on a German cover disc and never actually came out in the UK. It's sadly not quite up to the same standard as Lethal Zone though. It's a reasonably enjoyable Defender variant, where every now and then you can land your craft and start to run around on foot. That also happens if your craft gets destroyed. You can then run back to the base to get another one. The graphics are pretty decent, with some very smooth parallax scrolling, but the controls and movement feel a little bit stiff for my liking, and ultimately there is simply too much better competition out there. So I think this is going in the good category. and I think StarRay is probably slightly better, so I'm going to put it just below Pegasus. So there we go. That's another 44 side-scrolling shooters on the Amiga, all ranked. What I should probably do here is I should probably now try and combine the two lists to make one ultimate list of titles. So all of the essential games that from the last list are going to be combined with the essential games from this one, and so on and so forth. And those all should be starting to appear on screen about now. If you've disagreed with any of my placements on this one, then let me please once again reiterate that this is merely my own opinion, not the opinion of the UK Gaming Network team. If you think that a game should be higher up the list than I've placed it, fine. Please let me know in the comments where I've gone wrong in your opinion. Thank you for watching this list. I hope you've really enjoyed it. Please suggest any other categories that you'd like to see me cover in the future. Retro Game Super Leagues will be back in the new year, and I will probably start to include other formats at some point in the near future too. So please let me know what other systems you'd like to see me start covering. So thank you very much for watching. Until next time, happy retro gaming. Bye for now.